So today's video is all about the Canon 5D Mark IV. Sounds good. So this is a camera that has been knocking around for 4 or 5 years now, and it's always been considered a little bit of a dinosaur in some ways. I've been using it for all of that time in my life as a professional photographer as my main camera. I've shot hundreds of professional assignments with it, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of frames, and covered all kinds of different things with it. So I'm just going to talk today about some of my experiences of using it, and then talk through kind of all the different features, talk about some of the good things, some of the bad things, and discuss kind of how it stacks up in this day and age. But to begin with, I'll just show you a few of the pictures that I've taken with it, just to give you an idea of the kind of work that I've been shooting with it and the kind of pictures that it's possible to take with a camera like this. So here we go. Okay, so when this camera was launched, it kind of came at a time of kind of innovation within the camera market. So most of the manufacturers were going towards mirrorless, and cameras were getting kind of lots of different features that were really headline grabbing. And so when the 5D Mark IV came out, it was still pretty much the same as the 5D had been for, you know, the best part of the last 15 years or something like that, whenever the first one was launched. I've had all of them along the way, by the way. Didn't have the Mark I for very long, but I used the Mark II extensively, Mark III extensively, and now the Mark IV, along with some of the 1D cameras and 1DS cameras. But fundamentally, this thing was still pretty much the same as the Canon EOS 1 film camera that I was using back in the 90s. And this is kind of one of the things that's interesting about this camera, that although it's a dinosaur, and in some ways it kind of is, it also has all of the evolution of technology that was packed into this thing, and then all of the tiny changes that they made over the years in terms of different cameras. But the evolution of design has followed on from something that worked, I don't know, nearly 30 years ago, and still works, and kind of is all of those design things are still fundamental to the use of the camera. So where all of the buttons are and where all the controls are, it's still very, very ergonomic and evolved. And that's not true of a lot of the newer cameras that have hit the market, where their controls just don't work quite so well, or the menu systems aren't quite so functional. So what I'm going to do is just talk through some of the different elements and kind of different things of the camera, and talk about my opinions of them. And so firstly, this camera has handled everything that I've thrown at it, and I've shot everything from sports to portraits to landscapes, seascapes, interiors, social documentary and reportage. All kinds of different things have been shot with this camera, and anything that I've thrown at it, it's done really well. And I would consider that to be you know, kind of definitive of this camera, really, that it will do pretty much everything that you ask of it really well. Each of the things that we're going to talk about, there are always use cases where very specific genres of photography or types of photography will require something that is different or maybe newer, and everybody has to come to their own conclusions about these things. So these are just my experiences of using the camera. Okay, so to begin with, what is it? Well, it's 30 megapixel. CMOS sensor, and I think that the sensor is great on this camera. I think it sits at a really nice size. It's not crazy big like some of the cameras these days, where you're going to have to manage the cards are going to be expensive and big, and the file sizes are going to be huge, and you're going to have a power steam train of a computer to process those files, and then your hard drives are going to fill up really quickly, and auto produce pictures that a lot of the time are way in excess of the quality that clients might need, or you might even need if you're printing at large sizes. You know, I've printed a lot of work from 20 megapixel cameras at billboard size that's been fantastic, and I couldn't really question the quality of it. Everyone will be different, but that's just my experience. So 30 megapixel sensor in here, Canon color science is epic as always. The pictures, the main reason that I got hold of the 5D Mark IV, I was so happy with the 5D Mark III. The main reason I got hold of this was for the dynamic range. I was doing a lot of photography for one client in particular that really required stretching the most out of the dynamic range, so getting the most detail in the highlights and the most detail out of the shadows, and I was using all kinds of different techniques to get that, and I just thought that with the newer sensor there might be a little bit, maybe a stop more dynamic range, and I would say that's probably about true, and that's the reason that I got the 5D Mark IV. There was nothing really about the 5D Mark III that I didn't like, and it was doing everything that I wanted it to do. But having been using this for a while, there are lots of different, everything is probably about 20% better over the 5D Mark III. The autofocus is a bit sharper, but we'll come to that in a minute. The ISO range is a little bit higher, you can go a little bit higher than the Mark III, and we'll come to all of those things in time. Okay, so let's talk about autofocus. This is kind of one of the main areas with this camera where there are some good points and some bad points, I guess. So, it's probably got the best autofocus system that I have used in any of the Canon DSLR cameras. I know, haven't shot with the 1DX Mark III, and I'm pretty sure that's quite snappy. But this thing has done everything that I've wanted it to in pretty much any conditions. And I've shot in really dark conditions and challenging conditions and all kinds of things over the years. Now, it has a wide range of AF points through the viewfinder that you can select, but not all of them are the cross types. So the cross types are a little bit more accurate, and there are only a certain number of cross type AF points when you move the AF point in the viewfinder around. Now, some people would kind of moan about that. Personally, I don't really tend to use that many AF points. I kind of use the ones that I need, which aren't actually that many. And I always thought I was a little bit odd doing that, not making the full use of what the cameras were maybe capable of. And then I was talking the other day to a really experienced and very good wildlife photographer who only ever uses the center point, and his pictures are, you know, amazing, and has no reason to do anything different. So he's quite happy doing that, and I'm quite happy using the system that I do, and it, you know, results in good pictures most of the time, sharp pictures most of the time. We can get a little bit caught up in the whole AF thing of, it's become so complicated, you know, that there are so many different options if you look through the menu system for this camera of how you could set your AF up, and it will track, and then it will kind of be good for tracking an object that's increasing in speed or decreasing in speed, and all of those things are very good. But for most, you know, and again, this comes down to use case. If you're shooting, let's say you're shooting horse racing, then you're going to really need to make full use of those setups and really tweak it to your own personal the perfect settings to get what you want. But for most people shooting most things most of the time, the autofocus system, just in its standard guise on this thing, is more than capable of getting really great pictures in most occasions. However, there is a negative, and that is that the system that's in the R5 and R6, and I've been shooting with both of those cameras, and thanks to Canon, because they loaned me, they gave me a loaner for a little while. So I've got a bit of experience of shooting with them now, and the autofocus system in both of those cameras is just brilliant. I just thought it was epic. And so while on one hand I'm saying, you know, that the system in here is fine for most things and it's capable of very high quality photography of nearly all kinds of different subjects, the R system is just that little bit better. So if your requirements are really pushing the limits of what autofocus is capable of, then the R system is probably worth having a little look at. However, there are, you know, everyone has to find their own way with these things. And so frames per second, this thing will shoot at 7 frames per second, which is, I think, fast enough for most things, most of the time. If you can't get it at 7 frames per second, you're either shooting something that is really, really fast, like a leopard eating a giraffe at high speed, and you really need, you know, some of these newer cameras are, you know, dropping, I don't know, 30 frames a second or 20 frames a second or something, and that is great for sports. You know, it's great if you're shooting someone scoring the winning goal in the World Cup. If you're doing that, then you need to be looking at that sort of frame rate. But if you're not doing that, this will do everything that you need it to. And I was shooting some football the other night with this camera under floodlights. The autofocus was great and the frame rate was great, got me what I needed. But you know, everyone will have to find their own ways with these things. Okay, so I should talk about video a little bit, because I know most of my viewers kind of come here to talk about stills photography, but video is still a big part of what we do. I shoot video all the time, and this thing is a bit of a kind of, again, this is going to be a yin and a yang kind of appraisal, because the 4K on this thing is difficult. It's got a weird crop that crops into the image a little bit, which means that if you want to shoot wide, you need to use a super wide angle lens. And it also has a very strange codec, which means that it produces big old-fashioned files that fill up cards and use up memory space and are hard to edit. And there are better, quite frankly, there are better, much simpler 4K video options out there than this. Having said that, it does 1080 really nicely, and it will shoot at 50 frames or 60 frames a second in 1080, and it's great. And the autofocus works really well, probably the best that I've experienced in a DSLR full frame camera like this, certainly better than the Mark III or Mark II, that's for sure. Actually rather functional autofocus, though I tend not to use it. I tend to be much more of a manual focusing video kind of person for video. And in 4K it will only do 25 or 24 or 30 frames per second, and so that can be a little bit limited if you want to use it on a gimbal, say, to slow, and you want to slow it down by 50%. Although, having said all of that, it's got a great touch screen. It's got all of the controls that you would want, and it's got this kind of very soft touch on the screen for changing your settings while you're recording video, which works really well. So, you know, if 1080p is your thing, then yep, it will shoot great video. It doesn't have a flippy screen, which can be annoying if you're shooting video. And so then we come, so that's kind of us talking about video. You know, if you're into 1080p, it's kind of cool, actually. It produces a really nice image. If you want the latest, best 4K at 50 frames per second or higher frame rates, then this does have a slow motion mode, but I think it shoots 120 frames per second, but it's sort of 720, and it's not the best quality by any means. We're talking about the build quality and the layout and the buttons and the evolution and the screen and things like that. You know, this has got an optical viewfinder, old-fashioned, old school. There's no EVF in it at all, so what you see when you look through the camera is real life reflected in a mirror inside the camera, and that mirror flaps out of the way every time you take a picture and then exposes the sensor and the shutter. So there's a lot going on in terms of mechanics inside the camera. The build quality of this thing is epic. I've not had any problems with it at all. Weatherproof, and the buttons are really well evolved and very customizable, and they are kind of in the place where you want them to be. And I've had more success setting this camera up in a bespoke, I did another video about my settings for this camera, but I've had a lot of success setting it up kind of to work for me and my own personal requirements. So it's got the optical viewfinder, which is, you know, a lot of people will still like that. Some people will be moving towards the electronic viewfinder, which is where, like the R5 or the R6, for example, where you can see a little electronic image through the screen. Both have their benefits, both have their negatives. Everyone has to make their own mind up. And, you know, I would encourage anyone to try both, basically, before working out what it is that you like. Now, this leads me on to talking about this thing, which I use this thing, which is a Sekuto Z Finder, and I will make another video specifically about that. But because this thing's got a great screen on the back, it's a touch screen, by the way, which works really well. So you can flick through your pictures and you can zoom in and out, kind of like a smartphone, and then you can access all of your controls from the back, which is really cool. I didn't think it would be very good to begin with. Didn't think I'd use it, but it actually works really well. And because it hasn't got a flippy screen, it's still quite sort of tough, you know. You can still sort of use it without worrying about snapping something off. Although having said that, I've been using cameras with flippy screens recently, and I don't seem to have broken any of them. So kind of the idea that was locked in my head that flippy screens made cameras a bit fragile would seem to be I seem to be proving that wrong with time. But I use this thing, Sekuto Z Finder, and what I do is clamp it on the back, fire up the live view, and the live view autofocus is really good on this, on the 5D Mark IV, much better than anything else. And it uses a type of autofocus which I think is arguably as good as, or even maybe better than, the autofocus that you use when you're actually looking through the camera. So I put this on the back, clamp it on with this little mount that goes underneath, and then when I turn the live view on, I can effectively use it like a mirrorless camera. So I'm looking at the image on the screen. I can zoom in on the picture if I want to check for critical focus, if I'm using prime lenses wide open, for example. I can see the effects happening real time as I change my exposure, and I can use my stop down button on here to stop the lens down to check depth of field. And it works really well, and I use this about half the time. Typically if I'm doing sort of slightly more considered and slower photography, and I might want to check my settings as I go along, works really well. And then the best thing about this, which cameras with electronic viewfinders don't have, is when you then want to go back to shooting with an optical viewfinder, I can just rip this off and go straight back to looking at the real world again. So it's kind of, in some ways, it's the best of both worlds. It's obviously not an elegant solution for those seeking a small, compact camera system, because look, once that's on the back, it turns into quite a kind of Frankenstein lump. I have talked about this in another video, which is about the Canon 5D Mark IV settings, and I will make another video specifically about the whys and how-fors with this thing. Sekuto Z Finder if you're interested. Okay, image quality of the camera I think is great. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I've had absolutely no issues. And I tend to push and pull my files around quite a lot and do all kinds of different styles of photography, and I haven't had a problem with image quality whatsoever with the 30 megapixels from the sensor in here. I think it's great, and I wouldn't, shooting with the R5 recently, I can kind of see, you can see a little bit more detail, but actually I shot them side by side, and to be perfectly honest, I'm a bit of a Philistine with these things. I couldn't really tell the difference in the image quality, to be perfectly honest. And then I shot it alongside the R6. So the R5's 45 megapixels or something like that versus the 30 in here. Couldn't really see the difference. And then I was shooting it alongside the R6, which is only 20 megapixels. And again, I couldn't really see the difference. But that's probably more to the fact that I just kind of look at my pictures. I don't pixel peep too much, but I kind of am a perfectionist. So I'm always looking for the difference. I'm looking for the errors in things. And I just thought that both of those cameras were really good, but I couldn't really see much difference between the finished files from any of them. I'm imagining if you crop or maybe go into sort of really pushing those files in certain ways, then you might start to see a difference. I'd be interested to hear your opinion if you've been shooting, experimenting with these cameras or using one over the other. ISO, this thing goes up to, good lord, it goes up to 150,000 million or something like that, 150,000 ISO. It's a huge amount, and I shoot with it up to about 12,800, I think. I was using it the other day when I was shooting a storm, and I was photographing at night, and there were waves crashing, and it was really, really dark, and I just had to crank the ISO right up. And I was really surprised that the pictures were actually okay. 12,400, sorry. And yeah, I think that's right. These numbers just become telephone numbers to me after a while, to be perfectly honest. But very good at high ISO. And I would say it's about a stop or two better than the, maybe even, yeah, I'd say it's 2 clean stops better than the 5D Mark III, and considerably better than the Mark II. In terms of the R5 and R6, I don't know. I haven't tried those cameras at really high ISO, but I'd say it's probably ish around the same. Other people might have different opinions. Let me know. Another good thing about this camera is it doesn't have the CF Express card. It has compact flash and SD card, which I'm a big fan of both of those cards. I've got loads of them, and they are both robust systems that are available very cheaply, and it just kind of works. And the file size from this thing is kind of manageable for most computers and most cards, and it kind of becomes something that actually you don't need the very latest computer to be able to process, although the files are still big when you shoot in. I shoot in RAW most of the time, and but the JPEGs out of this camera are very good. And I've been a RAW shooter for the last, I don't know, 15 years or something like that. And recently I've started to become more interested in the idea of just shooting JPEG, because the cameras are becoming so capable and the JPEG technology is so good that I think that for a lot of what I'm doing I could probably just start using JPEG. Interested to hear your opinions about that subject as well. So this thing has GPS in it, so it will tag your pictures wherever you are in the world. I think it will tag them, and then you can see in the software where you are, which I've not used it personally. I've used it to try it out, and you can spot in Lightroom where you are. It's quite interesting, and I guess if you're a landscape photographer going to some pretty far off locations, it could be quite handy to have that GPS location for you. But personally, I use a different system for that kind of thing, and it's something that I've generally got it turned off. There's another thing in here that is the weirdest headline. So when this thing launched, there wasn't much about it to headline grab in amongst the opposition. You know, this is the last in a long line of the Canon 5D cameras that have, you know, arguably been the workhorse of professionals and advanced amateurs for the last 10 or 15 years. I don't think Canon's got any plans to make another DSLR, digital single lens reflex. And so this in many ways is kind of the end of a bit of an era, I guess. And it was interesting because the headline grabbing feature of this camera was something really weird called dual pixel raw. And to be honest, I didn't quite grasp the concept of it when it came out. Then it was explained to me by, I don't know if you know, Tony and Chelsea have a YouTube video channel. I watch them sometimes, not very often, and they did a video about it, and they asked for people to comment, and I sort of listened to what it was, and I think I sent a comment saying, I think this is salmon feathers, because it just didn't make any sense at all to me. It's like the most absurd idea. If you've made dual pixel raw work, then let me know, because maybe I've been missing out on the best thing since sliced bread, who knows. But to me, it was this idea that the camera would capture a bit more data, and then you could adjust your focus, fine-tune your focus or your bokeh in after capture in post-production, which, you know, is a great concept, but I just think in the real world maybe it just doesn't work very well. And from what I can gather, it doesn't. I've never turned it on at all, to be perfectly honest. The colour, like I say, from this camera is awesome. I've never had a problem with colour. Nearly all of the pictures that I capture kind of could just be used pretty much straight off the card, and I then do post-production to add whatever feel I want to the pictures. But the colour is great. There are a couple of bad things I want to talk about. The first being the battery life on this thing is not as good as any of the other Canon 5D cameras that I personally have had. And with all of my other 5Ds, I've never really had to think about battery life, to be perfectly honest. I'd make sure the battery's charged up before I go out, have a few spares, but typically batteries wouldn't be an issue. This camera, they have been an issue. And I typically go, you know, on a big shoot, I might go through quite a lot of batteries. And I don't know quite why that is. I know that other people have had similar issues with the 5D Mark IV, but it is battery hungry. It has no flip screen, which is a pain in the backside if you like making you know, YouTube videos or content like this, or you like taking pictures from low angles or high angles. When you know that there are cameras that have these things now, it kind of feels a little bit old-fashioned. And this thing is a dinosaur, you know, let's be honest, but it's a really, really, really good dinosaur. Just because something's old doesn't mean to say that it's no use. And I know that there are some amazing photographers using this camera and that will continue to use this camera for the longest time with no issue at all with it. The other problem that I've experienced with it is that it has this Wi-Fi connectivity, which means that you can connect it to your phone or to your laptop, and the idea of that is great, that you can tether wirelessly and send pictures and control the camera and so on. But in practice, it works, but it's been ever so slightly clunky, and it will drop out of connection or it won't be there. And I've made it work on shoot, so it does work. And I think the more that you use it, the more that you become capable of understanding it and then building kind of a system where it works. But for me, I just wish it was a little bit simpler or a little bit more kind of bulletproof. But that's only my experience. Okay, I guess we should talk about the price. This thing is, you know, it's still expensive new. You can still buy them new. I think in the UK it's about £2,800, something like that. Secondhand, you can pick it up for less than £2,000, probably more like £1,500. And like I said, the build quality is good, and the life of the longevity of it is good, I would imagine. So I wouldn't really have a problem buying something like this secondhand. But the price point is high, I guess, if you compare it with some of the other cameras that are offering more in terms of headline grabbing features that are on the market now. But it's still not a bad price for a full frame camera that will be reliable and work for years to come. So just a couple of other things just worth mentioning. This thing has an inbuilt intervalometer and an inbuilt bulb timer, which is, you know, great for long exposures and great for time lapses. and that's awesome because it means you don't have to take an extra timer around with you and the batteries to fire it up and the lead and all of that stuff, so it just reduces a little bit of the faff. And it also has this very cool Q button on the back, which enables you to access all of your settings really quickly and the menu, and with the touch screen. I don't know when it was first introduced, but it just works really well with the 5D Mark IV because it just enables you to crank through all of your settings really instinctively and quickly. And I don't think there's, you know, for me, that's awesome. And I think that kind of leads me into my summary, which is also this thing has HDR built in, which works okay, and it also has some kind of different colours that you can apply, different creative kind of filters. It's not really like you might get on an iPhone, for example, but you can set it to black and white, for example, and it'll take a black and white picture for you. The RAW stays the same, but I think you get JPEG spat out that's black and white. I might have got that wrong. Who knows? You know, let me know in the comments if you use those settings a lot. But you know, ultimately, this camera is the derivative of the EOS 1, which has been, this whole system has sort of been the backbone of professional photography for the longest time. It's a shame because I don't think they're going to be making another one, but in many ways this borrows so much of the evolution and design from all of those years of use, and Canon kind of tweaking things a little bit to make it just a little bit better on each incarnation of the camera. And so while it might not be the newest thing on the block or the most headline grabbing camera, it's got all of that evolution behind it. So in many ways it is so well evolved. And I think, you know, I'll be using it for years to come, and I think lots of other serious photographers will be as well, just because of its ability to just kind of get the job done. And there's always cameras with different feature sets that will be better for specific types of photography, and everyone has to make their own mind up about those things. And yet this is a camera that is capable of doing everything that I've thrown at it over the last 4 or 5 years, and producing pictures all the time that far exceed my own quite picky expectations, and also that of my clients, because I have pictures used all the time in magazines and newspapers and corporate brochures, and all the way up to sort of billboard size, quite large pictures of all kinds of different things, and I've not had a problem once with quality from the files out of this camera. The thing that I would say to you is that if you are kind of in the process of comparing cameras and trying to decide which one to buy, then really you need to, you know, just listen not too much to what everybody says. I can only give you my experience, and you need to go and find your own way with camera systems, and you need to try them out, get them in your hand, fiddle around, feel where feel where the buttons are and where your fingers lie, and where how it feels when you look through it, and you know, make your own mind up. I can only give you my experience of using it, but my experience of using this thing over the last 4 years, good. I just need to finish by saying, you know, we are going through some challenging times in the world at the moment, and good Lord, you know, my thoughts are with people, any people that are suffering or struggling with it all. You know, it's awful, and I hope we can find some resolution soon. And you know, from my heart to yours, if you're struggling, you know, horrible. And also my thoughts are with, you know, some of my ex-colleagues from my newspaper days who are actually shooting in some pretty tricky conditions at the moment, and I wish them safe home. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know any of your thoughts or comments, or just let me know how you're doing. You know, it's always good to talk in the comments with people. It's great. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.